Please listen carefully.
Hello, and welcome to GasGasGas. This is the best podcast for the FRCA primary exam. Our goal is to fill your brain with all this highly useful information. You might be in the gym right now, commuting, or ironing your scrubs. Regardless, the revision is eventually going to end, but for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Make sure to check out GasGasGas.uk. The show notes there's loads more detail. Make sure to like and subscribe. Anyway, buckle up, get ready for your mind to be bent into a new shape, and let's get on with the show. Hello everyone, this is James at GasGasGas. Today we are talking about Dexmedetomidine. We're going to talk pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics. There are a number of predetermined tangents we're going to dip into, particularly the briefest moment on what the reticular activating system actually is in the brain. A bit of an exploration into how you might actually go about sticking a number to describe the lipid solubility of a drug or lipophilicity of a drug. And there's one third little tangent, but I'm not going to tell you about that one just yet. So if you're enjoying the show, make sure to tell your mates, like, subscribe, do all those sorts of magical things. And if you feel like you're really benefiting a lot from these episodes, think about chucking us a donation. But now for the delightful moment you've all been waiting for, and don't worry, I'm going to tell you the molecular weight of dexmedetomidine shortly. We're going to get on with the show. So, dexmedetomidine. Other names for this drug include Precedex, which is the brand name in the United States, and Dexdor, which is the brand name in the United Kingdom. It's been in use in the United States since 1999, and it finally made it through the graceful doors of the United Kingdom in 2011. It's an imidazole derivative. Lots of drugs are imidazole derivatives though, such as our dear friend etomidate. This behaves entirely differently to etomidate. How is it presented? So it is a clear, colourless liquid presented in 100 micrograms per mil. Classically, you get a 2 mil ampule, so 200 micrograms. It is an enantiomer pure preparation, so it is the D enantiomer, as the other half of the racemic mixture was inactive. The racemic mixture was called medetomidine, and I think it was mostly used in the veterinary side of things. Brief side note here, we've called it the D enantiomer, Dexmedetomidine, D being dextro. The opposite of dextro is levo, i.e. like levobupivacaine, and that's with the polarized light approach to classifying enantiomers. However, it's important to remember that there's another way of classifying enantiomers that we mentioned in that previous episode, which I'm sure you've listened to several times now. Detailed notes taken, which is the Kahn-Ingold prelog method, where you end up with either a sinister or a rectus enantiomer. And this is the one, remember, where it takes the atomic numbering approach, whereby it goes from lowest to highest, and if that tracks around the molecule in a clockwise or counterclockwise manner, that's how they name it. So dexmedetomidine is also the S enantiomer, as well as the D enantiomer. Drugs can be S and D, or they could be S and L. They're not exclusive. If you've got your pens ready, I can tell you that the molecular weight of dexmedetomidine is 200.28 grams per mol. I had it there for completeness. If anyone is asking you that, I don't know. I mean, try not to look at the examiner with a withering look of absolute hatred and smile sweetly and say, not quite sure, perhaps 200. Because most of them do seem to be hovering around the 200 mark, aren't they? Try and get them to move on. Gloss over that bit. Mechanism of action. Dexmedetomidine is an alpha-2 receptor agonist. This seems to always fall out of my brain. I'm like, is it alpha-1? Is it alpha-2? Does it antagonize? Does it agonize? I don't really think there's any magical way of remembering this. Alpha-2 receptor agonist. Now, alpha-2, that means it's going to work on G-protein coupled receptors. We know that the alpha receptors are GI-linked, i.e. inhibitory, and we need to just remind ourselves that GI subunits break off from the inner workings of that protein complex, and they totter off and inhibit adenyl cyclase enzymes within the cell. This leads to less cyclic AMP, remembering that adenyl cyclase converts ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to cyclic AMP, adenosine monophosphate. This lack of cyclic AMP leads to less inhibitory activity on potassium channel activity in that cell. That means you've got more open potassium channels potassium leaks out of the cell and the cell becomes more negative because you're losing cations, positive anions. This impairs signalling. So where do you find these alpha 2 receptors? Well, all over the body, folks. The ones we're interested in are in the brain. As we all know, no drug is perfectly going to bind to just one singular receptor. They always get tempted. It's always like, you're walking down the cereal aisle, you're going straight for the porridge, but then you see the chocolate Weetabix minis, and you're like, oh, I have less affinity for those, but I still do fancy them. So drugs get tempted elsewhere, but they have a preference. Dexmedetomidine prefers alpha 2 receptors. Wouldn't it be absolutely delightful if we could put a number on this? And the answer is yes, we can, folks, because we can think about the ratio of affinity of dexmedetomidine to an alpha 2 receptor compared to perhaps an alpha 1 receptor. And when we're making comparisons, it's always useful to compare to a different agent as well. So we're going to compare it to clonidine. So if you had a gaggle of alpha 2 receptors and alpha 1 receptors available to your measure of Dexmed and clonidine, the Dexmed would preferentially go for the alpha 2 receptor 1,620 times for every one time it was tempted towards an alpha 1 receptor. Clonidine, the ratio is 220 to 1, so you could approximate that Dexmed is about 8 times more interested in alpha 2 receptors versus alpha 1 receptors compared to clonidine. So it's much, much more interested in alpha 2. This bears a degree of relevance because at our sites of action, because there are a number of sites of action for these alpha 2 agonist drugs, you also find alpha 1 receptors, and the alpha 1 receptor agonism actually causes contrary effects. So clonidine almost inhibits itself slightly, at least according to Peck and Hill. Less of an issue with dexmedetomidine. Now, so we now know what receptor it agonizes, but where are these receptors? It seems that they're all over the place. But the ones that perhaps play a more useful role in the effects we are looking for with Dexmed is the locus ceruleus, that's found in the upper pons. That is involved in waking and arousal, and it releases noradrenaline normally. Locus ceruleus means blue spot. I imagine if you were to slice into someone's brain at the right height, you might find a blue bit. Dexmed also has activity in the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, acts on other elements of the reticular activating system, and is also found to have a degree of activity in the spinal cord, where it either, because no one's really clear on this, increases the release of endogenous opioids or inhibits the release of endogenous nociceptive agents like substance P. Substance pain, substance P. Doesn't seem that clear. Now, just very quickly, a brief dip into neuroanatomy here, of the very briefest moment, because it's not in the exam, it's just for interest. So feel free to, daydream looking out the window or refill your iron as obviously you're ironing your scrubs. So the reticular activating system. This gets bandied around. People say, oh, this and that, and arguably, who the heck knows what that is? So it's actually made up of 4 elements. The locus ceruleus is found in the reticular activating system, and as I said, involved in waking, arousal, and it's NORAD releasing. You'll also find the Rafe nuclei. These are found in the midline of the brainstem at heights of midbrain, pons, and medulla, involved in pain, mood regulation, arousal, and attention, and that's serotonergic. The third element of your reticular activating system is the posterior tubomammillary hypothalamus, which is a mouthful. It's histaminergic, involved in wakefulness, cognition, and arousal. And then finally, the pedunculopontine tegmentum, which is cholinergic and is involved in the shift from sleep to wake. I imagine most drugs that have sedating effects are probably messing about somewhere in here. Now, what's the role of the RAS overall? Well, it sounds like it's either going to be keeping you awake or enabling you to sleep. Generally speaking, if anyone asks, they won't. The RAS is involved in swinging you from some different stages in sleep. I'm telling you this because dexmedetomidine creates a sleep-like sedation as opposed to a truly bonked on the head, anaesthetized hypnotic state. So the RAS swings you normally from 2 rhythms in your sleep: stage 3 or slow wave sleep, sometimes called deep sleep, and then into fast sleep rhythms, REM sleep. Interestingly, the non-REM stage, this deep sleep, stage 3 sleep, sleepy, is the state that seems to be involved in facilitating the flow of CSF around your brain. Now, they've not really proved that in humans yet, but they have found it in mice. This CSF clearance system is called the glymphatic system, and there's postulation that this is involved in tidying up your brain. Proven in mice, not proven in humans, but they interestingly found in this mice study, and the mice study is linked at the bottom of the show notes, or you could probably just search for glymphatic mice sleeping or something like that, is that when these patients or mice were given zolpidem, which is a zopiclone, it inhibited this deep wave sleep. So actually, they didn't get the restorative sleep that you might otherwise expect. Now, I'm going out on a big limb here, but I reckon ITU patients who are sedated on propofol don't get any sleep, and they wake up bonkers because their brain is full of debris that they were meant to be neatly tidying away when they were in this delightful deep stage 3 phase. There isn't a big phase in your overall sleep cycle, but is important, and no tidying up gets done. So then they wake up and their brain is mad. Now, there's no evidence for that, and I could be completely wrong, but I just feel that that makes logical sense. I'd love to see some science. So that was my attempt at being uber brief with neuroanatomy, and I hope that you've now woken up and we're going to actually think, what does it do when we give someone Dexmed? Well, it makes them less anxious. It has analgesic properties or opioid sparing properties. It can mitigate some of the side effects and symptoms of opioid withdrawal. And as we've mentioned, it sedates people. And it's like a bit of a weird sedation because they're a bit dozy, sleepy. You can rouse them and prod them, and they'll wake up and make sense and then doze off again, which makes it quite a useful drug. So it can be used for Dexmed only sedation in MRI, chiefly for kiddies, echocardiograms in kiddies. It can be utilised perioperatively when you want to spare volatile or propofol, for example, when you need neurophysiology monitoring, maybe spines, etc. It's used for a sleep awake asleep craniotomy. You can get them quite delightfully dozy on the Dexmed, sneak in a bit of propofol here and there when you need it, like when you're Mayfield pinning or when you're squirting in stingy local anaesthetic. Seen it used for foreign body retrieval, where you carefully give someone Dexmedetomidine over maybe 5-10 minutes, get them quite dozy, and then very slowly creep up on the propofol and remifentanil. Very slowly. I'm not advocating you do this by yourselves, but it works really nicely. I've seen it. And it reduces your volatile requirements. Dosing it. There's lots of different doses. The classic regimen is you give someone a loading infusion of 1 microgram per kilo over 10 minutes, and then you drop down the rate to 0.2 to 0.7 mics per kilo per hour. If you're using it on intensive care because someone's rattling or they've got hypertriglyceridemia from too much propofol, it's suggested that you don't load the patient and you just start them at like 0.5 mics per kilo per hour and wait. It'll take a while to reach steady state if you do that, but it's a nice smooth takeoff. If you're doing the classic regimen, it probably takes 5 to 7 minutes for a dose adjustment to look and demonstrate the effect you were hoping to achieve. Worth stopping it about 5 to 10 minutes before the end of a case for it to start tailing off. That's used to get kids down to the anaesthetic room in the UK with a dose that's 3 mics per kilo intranasally. We'll talk about the bioavailability when we get to the kinetics section. 3 mics per kilo, squirt it up the nose. Half an hour, 45 minutes later, dozy kid who probably does have a lower blood pressure now, again, in a minute. Off to theatre they go, waft some volatile at them without waking them up. Done. Can also be utilised as sort of a one-off dose, 0.3 to 0.5 mics per kilo, given slowly, like in aliquots over 5 or 10 minutes. Smooths out extubation, smooths out emergence, obviously has some analgesic properties, but does cause side effects, although obviously the smaller amount of drug you give, the less you see side effects. That's sometimes utilised for tonsils and stuff. Okay, so pharmacodynamics. So we've almost crept our way through pharmacodynamics. One of the big elements here is the side effects. If you're talking about side effects of a drug, structure it by system. Start with either the cardiovascular system or, the most relevant system with the most relevant side effect. As you can expect with a hypnotic agent, it has cardiovascular system side effects, etomidate being the outlier. In a fit, healthy patient, given dexmedetomidine, you will expect a drop in their mean arterial pressure and a drop in their cardiac output. What causes that? So their stroke volume is stable, but their heart rate drops by like up to 30%. But what do you see first? Well, actually, you see first a paradoxical hypertensive state, especially with IV dosing. You don't really see it quite so much with other dosing that leads to a lower peak plasma concentration. That's because you agonize alpha receptors within the vasculature, and we know that NORAD, alpha agonist, increases your systemic vascular resistance, pushes your blood pressure up. You will get a responsive bradycardia to that as well. But then you get hypotension. Now, why do you get hypotension? Well, there is a degree of sympathetic nervous system outflow modulation that comes from the reticular activating system. And when that is modulated with these drugs, you actually see less sympathetic outflow. And this is why you end up with a lower blood pressure and a lower heart rate, because your sympathetic nervous system is less jazzed up. This can be utilized because Dexmed mitigates the sympathetic response to surgery and might also have some ischemic protective properties as well, although I think area of research there. So you've got a bradycardic patient you've just given dexmedetomidine to. Glycopyrrolate seems to cause a bit of a paradoxical hypertensive response if you're trying to just treat the bradycardia. I think most folks just accept that the heart rate's a bit slow. You could give metaraminol, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, cause a bit of squeeze, or you could reach for ephedrine. There is a dose-dependent reduction in catecholamines. This has a sustained effect after the patient's awake and in recovery. They still have quite a obtunded sympathetic response to the world around them. Respiratory effects. So generally speaking, in the doses we are using, it has minimal effects on the respiratory system, so it will keep people breathing. Now, it might mildly decrease minute ventilation, and the PaCO2 of the patient might creep up slightly, but it's not devastating. We've mentioned CNS-wise, you will see sedation and anxiolysis. There's also a degree of antiemesis because of the effects Dexmed has on dopamine in your locus ceruleus. I've come across a great new word here, which is psycholepsis or psycholeptics, which is just a fancy way of saying hypnotic drugs. GI-wise, it's an anti-sialog, gives people a bit of dry mouth. And from the renal side of things, it can inhibit antidiuretic hormone at the collecting ducts, causing a diuresis. So that's pharmacodynamics done. Now what about pharmacokinetics, remembering this as absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination? So routes of administration is probably the first thing to just briefly think about here. So you can give it orally, 16% oral bioavailability. You can give it nasally, 40% bioavailability, 45 minutes or so to work. If you can somehow convince someone to ribble it around their mouth for long enough, it's got an 81% buccal bioavailability. We mentioned it's really quite lipid soluble. It crosses the placenta and the blood-brain barrier really easily. How is it distributed? So dexmedetomidine is 94% protein bound. It likes albumin and alpha-1 glycoprotein. No surprises there. Clonidine, as a comparator, is only 20% protein bound, so the free fraction is much higher. Volume of distribution of dexmedetomidine, 1.31 to 2.46 litres per kilo. Or if you've given someone an infusion and you've reached steady state, 118 litres volume of distribution. It's got a distribution half-life of 6 minutes, i.e. kind of gets where it needs to go quite nicely. Doesn't take too long. It's really lipophilic. Its pKa is 7.1, so it's soluble in water. That's why your infusions can be in saline or glucose. I'm just breaking left here. How do we actually put a number on lipid solubility or lipophilicity of a drug? We've got something called the oil gas partition coefficient for volatiles. Don't really use that for this. We use something called the octanol water partition coefficient. We're going to use a log octanol water partition coefficient. The higher the number, the more lipid soluble. I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of numbers here. So how does Dexmed stack up? So Dexmed, its log octanol water partition coefficient is 2.8. So that means there will be 2.8 orders of magnitude. So that's not 2.8 times, that's 2.8 orders of magnitude. An order of magnitude is like 10 to 100 or 100 to 1,000. So remember, we're doing logs here. There'll be 2.8 orders of magnitude more Dexmed in the octanol within your beaker versus the water in your beaker. How does this stack up? So fentanyl, it's 4.05 and propofol is 4.33. So fentanyl and propofol are more lipid soluble than dexmedetomidine, but dexmedetomidine is still really quite lipid soluble. Morphine is 0.89, so you'll have 0.89 of an order of magnitude more in the octanol versus the water in your beaker of water and octanol. So that actually makes quite a lot of sense when you think about it. You're trying to study for the FRCA primary exam and your brain is probably melting. It's probably trickling out of your ears as we speak. It's going to get better. You're going to know loads of stuff. It's going to be really cool. So just keep gently plugging away at it. Don't lose your mind. Metabolism of dexmedetomidine. It seems there's a few different routes that Dexmed can take, but ultimately the end point is inactive metabolites. Mostly it's getting glucuronidated, but there is some cytochrome 2A6 action. Patients on enzyme inducers, as you might expect, can speed up clearance of Dexmed, and Dexmed has a reasonably high extraction ratio, so therefore more cardiac output equals more liver clearance of Dexmed. Where do these inactive metabolites go? Well, almost entirely in the urine, 95%, and a little comes out as in your poo via bile. Elimination half-life 2 hours, clearance 39 litres per hour, although that's not indexed to body mass, which is kind of unhelpful, isn't it? Other things to note: if someone's got significant hepatic impairment, don't give them as much drug. Old folk clear Dexmed at similar rates to the young, but remember, old folk are more sensitive to the drug, so you can have the same amount of drug in Mrs. Miggins and 18-year-old Charlie, but Mrs. Miggins is going to be flat as a pancake because she's more sensitive, so you don't need to use as much. An important note: hypovolemic patients do not like dexmedetomidine. You will tank their blood pressure and it'll be a mess. Dexmedetomidine can also unmask patients with orthostatic hypotension quite dramatically, and your kiddies and your adults post-op on dexmedetomidine are more likely to have a postural drop because remember, we've just inhibited their sympathetic nervous system. As you can imagine, other patients with slightly sketchy sympathetic nervous systems probably don't fare quite so well with Dexmed either. These are your diabetics with neuropathy and your chronic uncontrolled hypertensive patients. Now, you could make a good argument here that as we develop more experience with dexmedetomidine, we might actually realise that, well, propofol's not very good for hypovolemic patients either, is it? We shouldn't get too snared up on this sort of stuff, but it's, when you're venturing off into drugs unknown, those positions are harder to defend. And just harking back to our perineural local anaesthetic episode, we know Dexmed seems to be a great choice for bolstering our regional anaesthesia. There's a paper, Abdullah et al., but the crux of it is perineural Dexmed versus IV Dexmed versus placebo. What does it do to the block? So if you stick it next to the nerve, the block lasts 10.9 hours. If you give it IV, 9.8 hours. And if you don't give the patient any Dexmed at all, 6.7 hours. I'll link to those in the show notes. IV Dexmed prolongs your block. Dexamethasone IV prolongs your block. So why not give them a little bit? I don't know what doses they used, but I imagine that a delightfully Dexmeded patient who's having ankle surgery under a block, or maybe shoulder surgery, with a tickler Dexmed when it keeps them breathing might be quite pleasant. We just need to think: do these drugs keep patients in PACU longer? I've seen old folks who've been given clonidine spend ages dozing off in recovery. The likely answer is yes, they take longer in PACU. Now, you would hope that that's because actually the evidence would also suggest, well, yeah, they have less emergence delirium and they're easier to look after in recovery because, they're more analgesed, etc. From an evidential perspective, that doesn't seem to play out. But an N of 5 conversation with some recovery nurses at a local tertiary peds centre for the Dexmeded tonsils versus the non-Dexmeded tonsils, they preferred the Dexmeded tonsils because they took longer to wake up, so they were less challenging to recover. Don't know how great that is for theatre throughput though. So check out the show notes for more detail here, guys. There's a few bits and pieces on drawing up, mixing, a bit of conversation more about what doses to give and when you might do that, and obviously all the links to the papers that exist for talking about Dexmed in ITU, Dexmed in paediatrics, pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics of Dexmed, that paper about the glymphatic flow in mice and how it might influence brain tidying up, and how that could relate to our ITU patients not actually sleeping for 2 weeks. Poor things. Hope you have a nice weekend. See you next week. We'll probably do clonidine just to tidy things up. See you then.
Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you found it useful, but if you found it awful, do let me know. Please like and subscribe, register with whichever podcast platform you find yourself using, and leave a comment if you think I need to square something away. I just want to make sure that you guys know that every day you are getting better at this. There is a bucket of content to try and consume, and it is like drinking from a fire hose. Take it day by day, don't overcook yourself, don't freak out, and keep studying.